All right. Okay, thank you everyone for being here with us. We apologize for the technical difficulties. It's just a thing that's happening now. So we really appreciate everyone being here and attending today's event. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Priscilla Calleros. I use ella, she, her pronouns. I'm the Events and Outreach Manager with the Environmental Center. Our mission is to embed sustainability into daily life in Central Oregon. I would like to start our evening by paying respect and expressing gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we exist on. I encourage everyone that is watching at the moment to really just take a moment to center yourself and be present while I read the Environmental Center's land acknowledgement. The Environmental Center is on the traditional land of the Northern Paiute, the Wasco, and the Warm Springs tribe, known as the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Indian Reservation of Oregon. These tribes also had interactions with other surrounding tribes, including, but not limited to, the Klamath, the Modoc, the Yahuskin, the Santiam, and the Malala. We recognize and respect Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land where we live, work, recreate, and learn. Our facility, garden, and programs exist on stolen land. We are guests with our tribal neighbors, making homes and legacies in these spaces together. Many values, ideas, and resources the Environmental Center shares are rooted in Indigenous ways of life. When we call on our community to protect the planet and her people, we acknowledge that this interconnectedness has been delicately sustained by Indigenous people since the beginning of time. Throughout history and today, our Indigenous neighbors are most impacted by social and environmental injustices, reminding us that there is still work to be done. We will continue to learn from and build relationships with tribal communities who have a profound understanding of climate change and how to care for forests, deserts, waterways, wildlife, and people. We commit to uplifting, celebrating, and including Indigenous voices as we deliver programs, events, and advocate for a sustainable future. This land acknowledgement was developed in partnership with local Indigenous community leaders and elders who were compensated for their time and expertise. We are grateful to each of them for sharing their history and stories. I am going to drop a link in the chat, and I encourage everyone that is watching to read over the history and learn about the truth about our Indigenous neighbors. And we've put together lots of resources and organizations and local farms and a scholarship that folks can support and donate to. And that's on the link that I just put in the chat. If you scroll at the very bottom, you will find a list of businesses, organizations that you all can support. So thank you. So every other month, the Environmental Center and a local business partner to host Green Drinks. Green Drinks is an international concept and is a way to bring people and businesses together to discuss advancing a sustainable future for everyone in Central Oregon. We also are in a nonprofit. And so for those that are wanting to support our work, we encourage you all to go to our donate page and become a member. And with that, I will kick it over to Elizabeth Johnson, who is our host for today. The Peaceful Presence Project is a nonprofit organization based in Central Oregon. Their mission is to help communities live well, age well, and die well by reimagining the way we talk about, plan for, and experience the last stages of life. They are dedicated to the promotion of educational initiatives that increase literacy around end-of-life rights and choices. So without further ado, Elizabeth, thank you.
Thanks, Priscilla. And I think Jeff, I talked to Jeff when you were doing the land acknowledgement. He should be here now. Dr. Cami can see him in the list of participants. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with everyone today. It's amazing to see how much interest there was in this topic. And I know that I'm really personally looking forward to this conversation, and we're sorry about the technical difficulties coming into this space. So before I start introducing and pulling in, there's Jeff, pulling in our panelists, I just wanted to give a really brief overview of our organization. As Priscilla said, I work as the executive director of the Peaceful Presence Project. And we really, as an organization, provide non-medical support to people facing serious and terminal illness. So again, as Priscilla said, the bulk of our activities are on community education, advanced planning, or planning for advanced illness, and then bedside support and presence for individuals facing the dying process. And we really operate as a nonprofit because of a foundational belief that equitable and compassionate end-of-life care is a human right. And so we make our services available to everyone who desires our support. And two exciting projects that we have are an advanced care planning outreach project for unhoused or housing insecure community members, as well as the development of a No One Dies Alone program. So that's just a bit about us. And again, thanks everyone for being here. And I want to dive into this really important conversation at hand, which is looking at the greening of American deathways, something that a lot of people are really excited about, as well as this complex and larger question that this movement really invites around accessibility and equity challenges, land stewardship, the sense that there might be an erasure of lineages or knowledge sets that have actually maintained an ongoing relationship with land. You know, the idea that there might be something new about green burial. So when you registered for the event, you should have received a prompt to read an article by Corinne Ellicon titled "Whose Green Burial Is It Anyway?" And that is the title of our offering today. And so Priscilla, if you have access to that article, maybe you can again put that link in the chat box. That would be helpful. So I want to start bringing in the voices of our exceptional panelists today. And then after short introductions, I'm going to have Mary Ann from the Forest, and then Anna from Recompose just give brief overviews of the work that they're doing, and then we'll engage in a conversation directly focused on a lot of the points highlighted in the article, and then we'll close with a Q&A with participants. So the Environmental Center is based here in Oregon. We as an organization have our roots here in the West. So I thought what I would do is start with Mary Ann Perry, who's located here in Oregon, and then we'll make our way across the country. And we have a lot to get through. So I think what we'll do now is just sort of flash 1-minute self-introductions for each panelist, just so you can say what feels important for us to know personally or professionally about your work as it connects to these larger inquiries. And then we'll dig into some of these bigger topics. So Mary Ann Perry is the sexton for the Forest Conservation Green Burial here in Southern Oregon. Welcome to you. And what would you like to highlight as part of your personal introduction to this community?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I just wanted to appreciate you and Peaceful Presence and the Environmental Center. And it's an honor to be here with my fellow panelists. And I am, what do I want to say just by way of introduction? So I'm the sexton for the Forest Conservation Burial Ground, kind of like a cemetery manager, and we're located at Willowwood Ranch, just outside of the town of Ashland, just over the California border. And this topic is important to me personally and professionally, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you. So then let's go to Anna Swenson, who's the outreach manager at Recompose, which is a human composting death care industry company. So welcome to you, Anna. What do you want to share about your work in this space?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I am from Recompose. I'm our outreach manager. We are a human composting company based in Seattle, Washington on the Duwamish land. That's our land acknowledgement here. And our founder and CEO, Katrina Spade, popularized and legalized human composting. We were the first full service funeral home to offer human composting when we opened in 2020. And now we have transformed over 100 bodies into soil. It's a very interesting question that we're here today to discuss, and we've had all kinds of people come to us here at Recompose, and we're definitely interested in what that means, especially in terms of land, because we are creating soil. So what does it mean where that soil is used, and how can becoming soil be validating or not for some people?
Thank you, Anna. So let's move a little east to Jeff Lujan, who resides mostly in Colorado, but I know travels around a fair bit, who's a hospice and palliative care social worker, amongst many other things. So welcome to you, Jeff. What would you like to share about yourself personally in this space?
I forgot I had to unmute. Sorry.
So
First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. Tsiki Kwensiru Tsao Elam Haki Na Atsi Hime Depana and Siniku Elam Tayeme. I'm from New Mexico. Originally, that's where my family comes from. We're Pueblo people that originally were just south of Albuquerque. And as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm a hospice social worker. I travel around between Colorado and do a lot of work with First Nations communities up in Canada. And Elizabeth and I met on a different Zoom conference about grief and loss, and we had some interesting conversations on that. So I just am here to share whatever perspectives I might have to help facilitate the conversations that we're having. Happy to do that too.
Thank you, Jeff. Welcome. And then to the far east, we have Dr. Cami Fletcher, who is an associate professor of American and African American history at Albright College. And I have long respected her work through the Collective for Radical Death Studies, where she serves as the president. So welcome to you, Dr. Fletcher, and invite your voice into the space in terms of what else you want to say about yourself and your work.
Thank you all so much for having me. I really want to just foreground Corinne's work. I'm happy to be a part of a panel that's literally using her work as a catapult to understand these issues. So happy to be a part of that. If anyone is interested in learning more about decolonizing death studies, meaning to decenter whiteness from the field of death studies, to radicalize death practice, meaning to center BIPOC voices, Black, Indigenous, people of color voices. Check us out, the Collective for Radical Death Studies, radicaldeathstudies.com, and we are on most social media platforms.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. And we will, for all interested attendees here, we will share links afterwards for all of the groups and organizations and things that are mentioned in this space today. So we'll share that with people. So I wanted to come back to Marianne and Anna, and then we'll kind of go back into the Whose Green Burial Is It Anyway article and kind of pull that apart as a collective. But Marianne, I thought it'd be good just to go back to this question of what is green burial? You know, when we use that term or that exploration, if you could kind of just offer up an overview of what we're talking about via green burial.
Sure. Yeah. So my understanding in this context for green burial is that we're looking at really disposition into the earth in a way that doesn't inhibit decomposition. And some of the basic kind of criteria of what that means is that everything that's buried is biodegradable. And so the body is buried in either, some natural fibers or natural wood. So no plastics, no metals. The body is not embalmed. And there's no vault or grave liner, which is usually concrete or plastic. So that's kind of the basics of what I think is we're referring to with green burial. And then there's more to it than that. depending on, what a particular area is doing for green burial, shallow graves, land restoration, other things like that.
And since you're here in Oregon, and I know that there's a lot of individuals on the call or the space here from Oregon, do you want to say a bit about the forest, just in terms of your work and focus?
Sure. Yeah. So the forest is a natural burial ground. Like I said, just outside of the town of Ashland. We opened in June of 2020 on the grounds of Willow Whit Ranch. And so we are exclusively green burial, though we do welcome, cremated remains and human compost as well, which is legal in our state too. And it's kind of a whole life and death cycle place up at the ranch, because we're a working ranch, a certified organic farm, and also a community event space for, family reunions, weddings, all of that kind of thing. So yeah, that's what we're up to up there. We're at almost 5,000 feet in the lower Cascades.
Yeah, beautiful piece of property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. And then Anna, do you want to share just a bit more detail about Recompose and anything that feels important, kind of expanding the idea of what human composting is actually about, and then also the sort of the move into Oregon for Recompose?
Sure. So as I mentioned in my introduction, Recompose is a full service funeral home that offers human composting. We operate here in Seattle, but we welcome people from many states, and we have a lot of folks from California in particular, and Oregon, and all over the country. Our process, the legal and scientific name for human composting, is natural organic reduction. So you might have heard that as well. And it takes place indoors in what we call a vessel, which is a steel tube that can be reused. And each body is placed into the vessel with wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. And it's the microbes that naturally occur on and in the body and on the plant material that power the transformation into soil. And they create heat of over 131 degrees Fahrenheit, which breaks down the body and anything in the body on a molecular level. So pharmaceuticals, any drugs that were in the body, those break down over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. And then at the end of the process, there is compost or soil that can be used on trees and plants. And we have an agreement with a nonprofit forest in Southern Washington where folks can donate the soil if they choose. So we worked with Representative Pam Marsh from Oregon to pass a bill in 2021. And we're working with the various departments in Oregon to make sure that they have all the regulations in place. And I believe that there are some other companies that are also looking to operate in Oregon. So we're looking forward to offering it to Oregonians soon. And we already do. It just does require a trek to Seattle right now.
Thank you. Thanks for that overview. And for anyone that has questions specific to green burial or human composting, feel free to put that in the chat, and we'll kind of loop back around to that at the end of the Q&A if there's stuff coming up for people. So I just wanted to open the space for further conversation and sharing between all of the panelists here around the really important and the complexity of points raised in the Whose Green Burial Is It Anyway article. And I know when I first read it, it really challenged me in some important ways, including what I think, is often this human propensity to think about ways in a narrow or one-dimensional way, right? Like, of course, green burial is good, and end of story. So I want to acknowledge that the time we have here together is limited. There's no way we're going to have everything, nor do we want to have everything tied up nicely at the end of this hour. If anything, I feel like this is an invitation for people to begin to delve into and become more intimate with the intersectional realities and complexities that we're examining here today. It's the celebration of environmental benefits that come from the greening of American deathways, while also recognizing that it definitely takes a certain, I think, sensitivity or attunement to the historical and current considerations that challenge a lot of what's orbiting around green burial. So, Dr. Fletcher, I wanted to start with you, since you've had the most involvement with the Whose Green Burial article. Your work was quoted multiple times. And maybe for people who didn't have a chance to fully read the article, or maybe you read it a while ago. I wonder what you would elevate as some of the most important things, I think, to consider or maybe chew on when looking at the ethics and increasing awareness around green burial options. If you were to kind of bring some of those points into this community space right now, what would you ask us to really start to hold?
Yeah, no, sure. I remember Corinne quoting what I said about Jessica Mitford in her book, The American Way of Death, and particularly in what I was saying about the funeral directors. Because, you know, in her book, these white male funeral directors are the big.
Oops, we might have lost Dr. Cami.
Better context with this tension between, can you all still hear me? Says my
I think we
internet.
lost
Okay.
you there for about 10 seconds or so, Dr.
Minute.
Fletcher.
Okay.
So maybe go back a little bit, whatever
Okay.
you want to catch it.
I just want to say that pivoting from Mitford to what you said a little bit earlier in the conversation about the tension between land, groups of people who have come to occupy this country, these United States, and the relationship that they have with land, I think speaks volumes. When you're talking about the Black community who were forcibly enslaved and forced to toil and work the land to no gain for their own, that right there is tension. But when you read scholars like Diane Jones and other folks who've talked about the slave landscape, particularly these burial grounds, these slave cemeteries that they took ownership of, that was by their slave quarters, you know, their housing, that was by rivers, these unused places on the plantation, but specifically the burial grounds, right, that they took ownership of. I think that's a big, broad context to really think about when you're talking about this idea of land intention, which brings you right on to today, right? So some of you may or may not be familiar with the struggle that the descendant community is having with burial grounds where the ancestors are, because of Jim Crow segregation that allowed white Americans to just kind of bulldoze over these Black communities that had churches, that had burial grounds. Now it's this reckoning where the descendant community is saying, well, no, that's my land. My people are buried there. But the developer who holds the deed is saying, well, it's actually my land because I own the deed. So there's serious tension that's going on, and that's all due to racism, genocide, colonialism. And so you got to really think about pulling those things apart.
Thank you. And there's so much more to say there, but that's a really great foundation. And Jeff, I want to open it up to you as well. You are such a beautiful holder of story and so much land and earth-based wisdom that really sources from your ancestral lineages. Whenever we talk, I just am always pulled into the way that you relate to earth. And one thing that comes up for me is we were talking a while back and I was mentioning this article and Jeff, I said, you know, it's called, well, Whose Green Burial Is It Anyway? And Jeff said, oh, so that's what it's being called, green burial nowadays, huh? You know, and really referencing that this was something that your ancestors and your current family have had connections to for so long. So I'm just curious what comes up for you as you've explored, you know, maybe reading the article or just kind of listening to what Dr. Cami Fletcher has shared as well.
I really appreciate what Dr. Fletcher had shared, and that sense of connection to land based upon where the bones of your ancestors lie. In Hawaii, my former spouse is Native Hawaiian, and I learned to speak that language as well. But they have a term for their homeland. It's called Kulaiwi. And Kulaiwi literally means the plains of the bones. The idea that Your homeland is the place where the bones of your people lay. I remember one time sitting with my son on a mountain overlooking the plains there, looking towards the Rio Grande. And I said, literally everything that you see here, the very dust that's makes up the air that we're breathing in as we walked up that mountain. It's hot and it's dusty. I said, but the blood, sweat, tears, and bones of your ancestors are in this land. This is you. You are it. And there's a connection that's different. I think that comes from that. That to have that sense of, when did your family get here? It's like, well, I've always been here, according to the stories, but that the bones themselves in the land starts to feed you, because in a certain way that starts to nourish you. As we understand from the biological process, it breaks down and becomes the earth, and the earth becomes the plants and the animals that feed us. And so the land is us, and we are the land. What's interesting when we were having that conversation, when we were saying who's, or that's what we're calling it now, because that kind of burial practice has been continuous in some communities. Now, other communities, because of colonial influences, there was a harsh disruption of those practices. And please understand, I'm just speaking directly to the experiences of communities that I've been involved with. There's 500 different nations, and they all have different ways of doing it. I have friends that are in the Northwest Coast and have shared with me some of their traditional practices pre-contact. I spend a lot of time up in Manitoba with the Anishinaabe people. They shared with me those things, but all of them would be now what we would call green burial practices. But because of colonial influence and rules that have been imposed, for a long time, those traditional ways were cut off, and they were forced to use different practices, different modalities, whether it's putting somebody in a coffin or preserving them, or even just the challenges that I faced sometimes as a social worker here in Colorado, working with people of indigenous lineages from other places, wanting something that's more culturally relevant, but due to the specific laws and rules that say, oh, you have to be in a vault and you have to be in this kind of a casket, and there has to be all of these chemicals pumped into your body, and it's really counterproductive. And now it becomes access. That was the other thing that was interesting, that access to these things, which should be cheaper, is really limited by financial resource. And so now we're trying to work with these people. How do we get the body from Colorado all the way back to their home territories, where tribal sovereignty will allow these types of practices to take place? And so, yeah, it was just a paradox to me, like that in some places, literally all people could afford was to wrap somebody in a blanket. They couldn't even maybe have access to the other fineries that used to be accompany a burial, but just to put them into a blanket into the earth was all they could afford. And now to do that is priced out of most people that are living day to days. So it was an interesting thing when I was reading through the article, just trying to guide people in, as a hospice social worker,
Right.
looking for those types of more, I guess, environmentally conscious, practices, So yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. I don't want to take up all the time, but those are just some of the things that skip across the top of my head.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I'm sure there's so many thoughts going on for people around what you just said, and maybe some follow-up questions. Before going over to Marianne and Anna, I wanted to, Dr. Fletcher, another thing that stood out to me in that article was the idea that not catching that it may be hurtful to certain Black or African American families to denounce embalming or sort of this post-mortem restoration, in the sense of why that might be important in terms of racial violence, or give an example of engagement with the KKK, or different experiences where the way that the family needs to mourn is to be able to see the body in a certain wellness, or in the totality of how that person was in their embodied state. I'm wondering if you have any other kind of thoughts around that specifically.
Yeah, I mean, again, it just goes back to the importance of the undertaker and the funeral director in the Black community. When you're painting the undertaker and, in the American way of death, she's painting the undertaker as this kind of grubby, greedy, just bleeding the family in their time of need, right? Just for every single drop. Then you don't understand that this is a very Eurocentric way to look at death. The ways in which Black folks are dying in the 20s and 30s that she's talking about is not some deathbed scene. It's violent. The Tuskegee experiment, lynching, white violence, right? If you're talking about white supremacy, Black folks are dying because because they're in power, right? I mean, that's what white supremacy, and we're living in it now. So then where the prevailing theory is the ostentatious funeral. How dare these folks spend all this money on this funeral for drink and drunkenness, right? Prohibition, all of this is going on during this time period is negative. The drunkenness, I get that, but that's not what's going on in the Black community. When you're talking about, Carla Holloway, I encourage everyone to go out and get our book Passed On. She does a brilliant job of talking about this is not an ostentatious funeral. This is pageantry. This is emotion, emoting at the funeral. As you were saying, Elizabeth, if someone has gruesomely been lynched, and that was ritualistic, where these folks are burned, eyes gouged out, ritualistic, all types of, negative things going on, that funeral director, that undertaker can put you back together again. And the homegoing is going to be open casket. We want to see this person, and we want to see them as themselves and bring them humanity. So when you look at death from at the intersection of the Black experience, this is about someone's last presentation. This is about humanity. This is about connecting this person back to their kin. Racist white society will have you believe that nobody cares about this Black person, that they had no family, they meant nothing to their community, right? Our society will have you believe that. But then that's where, again, you look at the importance of the undertaker. And so, that's one way to definitely look at embalming. Also during this time period that she's writing about, the Great Migration had occurred, and at least 6 million Black folks had left the South, right? And so this embalming, the preserving the body, allows me to actually come back home to the South when my loved one has passed away. And so this is not just a quick type of thing, like the ceremony itself is very, very, very meaningful. So it's not just, again, this death denial that I am afraid of death, I'm beautiful, I am, scared of death. That's what the literature is telling you. And the Black community is absolutely different, but you have to be able to understand the ways that colonialism, as Jeff is saying, has really disrupted certain things and remade it, right? Remade it about freedom and humanity. So those are definitely some different ways to look at it.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. That's a really important historical and current context framework in a lot of ways. I'm wondering for Mary Ann and Anna, who are currently doing this work via, green burial in Southern Oregon, the forests, and Recompose, what comes up for you as opportunities or challenges, not that you actually have all this figured out, but what kind of what's circulating within your worlds as you hold these kind of micro meta realities or questions. You want to start? Marianne, do you want to start and jump in? Then we'll go to Anna.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, I just wanted to start by saying I surprised myself when I've read this article several times since it was first put out there, and I appreciate that Corinne and Cami's work was put out there in this way. What surprised me was how much my heart was pumping again when I read it, of just my own kind of defensiveness, like I don't say that, I don't do, that pretty predictable, I think, given my, background and who I am, just of how the culture that I am in and living in, but definitely surprised me at the same time. And, there's my personal connection to this and then my professional role. And I would say that some of the things mentioned in here and also in the Dr. Fletcher's article on Jessica Mitford's work, it's a lot. I remember reading that book, for the first time years ago, and just again through my lens of how I have been brought up in the world and my daily life, just reading it. Yep, that's my experience. And then reading her article and was like, and so I believe that we do better. I do better when I know better, and so I appreciate learning about that. And in our context here, where I am in Southern Oregon, it's pretty easy to not attend, honestly, to much of any of this in a daily way. So it does take, and I'm thankful that as a business, we do make time for this kind of thing and to learn and to be uncomfortable. And also there's, like, for me, just it's confusing and uncertain at the same time. And we are wondering through this kind of work and through other things that we do of, what is our role and what do we want to do, and our policies, just all the layers within what we offer. Wanting to look through more of this kind of lens with that.
Thank you. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks for the honesty and reflection. Anna, what would you add to the conversation?
These are good questions, and I'll echo Marianne that, I'm a white person. Seattle is very white for systemic racism reasons, and it was easy for a long time to not attend to these questions, but I've learned from a lot of great death care professionals here in the Seattle area. Lashana Williams, who runs A Sacred Passing, has taught us a lot, and we work often with her hospice clients. And one particular interesting question about our process is that, biologically speaking, a body that has been embalmed can't undergo human composting because it impedes the decomposition process. So we've tried really hard to present this as an option for people who want it and for whom it resonates, and not as a prescriptive thing that everyone should want or have. So there are definitely decisions that you can make that may not be the least carbon impactful option, but it resonates with you for other reasons. And we try to validate all choices.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. I'm aware of time here too. Priscilla, I know we have some questions in the chat box. Jeff, just before we go to that, is there anything you want to speak to that you heard any of the other panelists say? I want to make sure we really get your voice equally in here.
Just one thing I wanted to also, I remembered something that Dr. Fletcher had said about that practice of desecration of burial sites. That there's a ongoing consideration or concern of ancient burial sites that aren't categorized officially, but that live in the forests. A friend of mine who's from Vancouver Island said that some of the peoples in that area had a practice at one time of wrapping those that had passed in cedar bark and putting them in the crux of a cedar tree. And over time, that tree would grow around it. And people remember which tree those ancestors was in. And then when these clear cutting happened in the late 1880s, it was a huge tragedy because they're literally clear cutting entire family lineages, their connection to the land. The same thing happened in the Neta down there by Black Mesa with the Peabody coal mine. Many traditional Navajos, a friend of mine that's from up there, they said that the older people, when somebody would pass inside that hogan, they would just allow it to return to the earth. And so there's these mounds here and there that they knew where those people were. And that when someone is born, that the afterbirth is planted under a juniper tree. And so then that, that belly button, that's our connection to our human mom, and that tree is our connection to our, our earth mom, our big mom. But when they would go in with these, this clearing that they would do to prepare for this strip mining, they have two bulldozers and they put a big anchor chain and just scrape the land. And they're scraping all those trees and they're scraping all of those mounds. And so when Dr. Fletcher was talking about that, development that's happening on places of green burial. I mean, traditional green burial, that kind of desecration or that resonated deeply. So I wanted to just acknowledge and thank Dr. Fletcher for bringing that up. There's a lot of malls that many of us shop at that are on burial sites of peoples that were here thousands of years ago, and their descendants still walk these lands today. So that was just one thing that came up.
Thank you. The imagery around that is really striking and powerful. Thank you. Priscilla, I'll turn it over to you and see what you want to bring into the space in terms of questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions and comments. I'll start with someone mentioned earlier about the teeth and the bones being converted to soil. If folks want to talk about that.
Yeah, so I see most of the questions are about the realities of human composting, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat to our website, and I can go through them one by one, but I don't want to take up too much time from the panelists. So here's the answer on the bones and teeth, and then I'll link you to our FAQ page as well, so you can answer those in a self-driven way if you want. But we know that yes, the bones and teeth break down, and we've done this over 100 times now, well under EPA levels for any pharmaceuticals that would remain in the body. And we also did a soil study with Washington State University. So we know this is safe and effective.
Thank you, Anna. We have another question in the Q&A. What about alkaline hydrolysis?
I can speak to this if no one else wants to. Alkaline hydrolysis is also called water cremation. It also uses about 1/8 the energy of conventional cremation or burial, and it uses a machine, and it takes a few hours to reduce the body into similar to cremated remains, like a sandy material. It can be less expensive than some other options, and it's also legal in about 30 states. So it's another green death care option for those that it resonates with.
Thank you, Anna. I don't see any other questions. Elizabeth, I will pass it back.
I see a question there. Somebody asked about what are the costs involved in green burial and human composting that maybe Marianne and Anna can speak to.
Yeah, I mean, it's really variable. And so there isn't kind of a definitive answer. I mean, I think like Jeff was saying that the inclination is like, shouldn't this be cheaper? Because I'm not paying for the X, Y, and Z. And I think the reality and the nature of at least how a lot of kind of natural burial grounds, conservation burial grounds are working is that not always cheaper. Sometimes it is, but sometimes the burials are sort of the income stream for other effort, land conservation or other things that the burial is really kind of paying for. Yeah, so variable, and if there is a burial ground, I encourage people just to visit their site to see the pricing structure. But yeah, there isn't really a definitive answer on that.
And is green burial available in all 50 states in the US, Marianne, or how does that break down?
Yeah, I mean, you can find, I'm sure that you can find somewhere. I'm not sure that every state has a certified natural or conservation burial ground, by the Green Burial Council. But even, some what might look like a lawn or conventional cemeteries allow some version of green burial, like maybe foregoing the vault, or, it's not a requirement to be embalmed for any burial. Yeah, and letting you use a shroud or a natural material casket, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Anna, do you want to speak to Recompose and the kind of general costs around human composting?
Sure. So the Recompose price for human composting is $7,000. That includes the transformation into soil, transport within the Seattle area, support from our funeral directors, and the soil if you want to keep it or donate it, as well as the death certificate and what you might expect from a funeral home. So to place that in context, the average cost of a funeral with cremation is about $7,000 nationally, and for conventional burial, it's over $10,000. Of course, it varies widely across the states. So we are definitely conscious that $7,000 is a lot of money. It's the amount that we are able to create a sustainable business, and access is on our minds, as is ability to scale and provide this. So yeah, it's a constant challenge that we are always bumping up against capitalism, because we don't want to charge too much, but we don't want to pay our people less. And we know there are people who want this, and there's an environmental impact, but we don't want it to be only out of, range for people who, make money because of how the systems are the way they are. So yeah, they're good questions, but the short answer is it costs $7,000.
Mm-hmm. I see another question from somebody, Spy. It says, would human composting help with the tensions around ownership of land? For instance, where does the compost ultimately live? So you mentioned that you have a relationship with somebody. Like where does the majority of extra, how does that work?
Yeah.
Take something, and where does the other land go? Or
sure.
compost?
So it creates a cubic yard of compost, and about half of families want to take home all of the compost, all the soil, and use it on their own yards for trees and plants. We do have it's a nonprofit that owns a piece of land in Southern Oregon where you can donate the soil, and they use it on their repair work. For example, they just removed a bunch of invasive Himalayan blackberry, and they're replanting the land fostered by this soil. I don't know about the answer of who owns the land. It's an interesting and ongoing question. The land is owned by a nonprofit that was created by white people, but it is ancestral native land. What is our role in that? It's a good question.
A big question.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, there's some questions. We have, how do we promote green burials while also respecting the land, acknowledging the Stillman land? And land seems like such an important place to remember our ancestors. Are there traditions for death and bodies which are not tied to remembrance and commemoration at a specific site or cemetery, burial ground, etc.? So 2 questions.
Jeff, is there any piece of that speaks to you that you would want to speak to? Do you see that question there?
Um, hmm. I know that there are some traditions in where the body is exposed to the elements, right, and then it returns to the elements, or even like through cremation, and then it's returned to the. So it's not necessarily a specific site, but this understanding that the body has returned to the greater nature. That's not necessarily part of my personal ancestral lineages. I'm just aware of that, so I can't really speak in depth to that, other than I know that there are some that are that way. Or returning bodies to the ocean, for example, or to after what do you call it, cremation, to return it to a river. That's how they do it in India, yeah, in the Ganges, right? Because it's a sacred river, the source of all things, and so it's deeply connected to their worldview, their cosmology, and I think that's what ultimately these things come down to. These traditions, these long traditions, it deeply ties people to their creation stories. Many people talk about those original instructions, and so some tribal peoples say that this is how we were told in the beginning that we're supposed to do it, and if you guys do it that way, that's good for you guys. There's no judgment, but to do it in our way, this is how we're supposed to do it. This is what we've been told, and that is perpetuated in that way. So.
Thank you. I see Dr. Fletcher. Do you want to? I see your hand up.
I absolutely want to chime in. When you're talking about land and remembrance in these United States, like there's privileges. There's privilege in saying I want to disappear in death. There's privilege in that. And we do something every other month called Rad Death Reads over at CRDS. And we have important discussions about this. Last February, I led one that was specifically about African. Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
Yeah, you're back.
I'm back. I led a Rad Death Reads last February that specifically talked about African American deathways and death work. In 1 week, we talked about Black Ancestors Matter. And we remember in this country, based on monumentalism, how big the obelisk is, how creamy white that headstone is. I mean, you can dance around it all you want to. But we, as Americans, and however you want to define that, we, New England cemeteries is how we define our past, right? Which is absurd because people were here. This is what Jeff is talking about. But how we want to define American history, there's so much to go into that. But I will say American Studies and those folks that were writing about it, and even with American Gravestone Studies that I'm a part of, very much a part of, a card-carrying member, some of the earliest ideas of who we are as Americans came from New England cemeteries, right? And this was what we value, what's sacred, what we put stock in keeping. Meanwhile, Native American graveyards are in a museum somewhere, right? Dug up, nobody's permission, right? So we can't dance around this issue of being environmentally conscious. Why? Racism is what's killing us. Colonialism is what's killing us. And now you want to try to put it on me that I'm having a funeral with all these chemicals in the air, and I'm the one that's killing our planet, and now I want to be remembered. And I would just be remiss not to say that, not to just openly say that there's something about land. Land meant freedom in this country. Land meant freedom. When you were an indentured servant, If you lived 1600s, 1700s, right, then you got 50 acres of land in Maryland specifically, and a gun and a cow and some other stuff. So I just want to be very, very clear of what we're talking about when people say green burial. And look, I've got canvas bags. I'm not getting on a soapbox. This is all connected, right? If you want to understand colonialism, you cannot start saying, oh, now this is what we need to do, because it does draw a divide. And I know Desmond Tutu had aquamation. I'm probably saying the term wrong, but he was cremated in that way and wanted to. But I think there's some serious issues about wanting already marginalized people in life to disappear in death. And I did not answer the question. So the last thing I will say is definitely with the Black experience, there are traditions that are not tied to the body. I wrote a lot about it. The RIP t-shirt, the funeral programs, there's lots of traditions that we do that are not just tied to the body, but the body is important and we don't have to shy away from it.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Fletcher. I'm conscious of time, Priscilla. I just saw a couple questions in there about connection to Central Oregon and being able, what's the closest place for people to access green burial options? Maybe we end on that. Marianne, what would you say to people that are in Central Oregon?
Can you say that again?
There's just a couple of questions in the chat box about people that are located in Central Oregon wanting more kind of resources or information about green burial, if that's an option or what it looks like for people.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so I encourage folks always to visit the Green Burial Council's website to look for options. In terms of, your actual disposition, your body can still, qualify, I guess, for a green burial and be transported to your chosen location for disposition. So yeah, that's an option, and you can visit, like I said, the Green Burial Council or any particular burial ground's website, or check out the forest page. We have an FAQ section that gives lots of links to other resources for how to handle that kind of thing.
Great. Priscilla, I'll hand it back to you before we.
I just want to acknowledge Jeff has his hand raised.
Yeah, great.
And this is actually probably a question that Dr. Cami Dr. Fletcher can address. I saw it come up in the chat a little bit earlier. Somebody was asking about places where conversations about decolonized burials can be engaged in. I don't know where those would be. I don't know when I hang out at my house over a cup of coffee, we could talk story. But I think Dr. Cami probably has some better resources to share.
No, sure. I'll just put in the chat. We have some stuff on YouTube, and I'm going to put in the chat about Rad Death Reads, because this is something we do every other month. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. And I definitely want to hear more of your stories. So you'll be getting some emails from me.
Jeff's a good storyteller. I always enjoy hearing from both of you, from all of you. Priscilla, I'll let you close it out. I just wanted to say thank you to Anna and Marianne and Dr. Fletcher and Jeff for joining us in this space. And I will put a link to the website for our organization in the chat box as well. And I know that Priscilla will follow up with an email to everyone with links for all connected conversations and resources that came out of this space. And I know that there's probably a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the chat box as well, but feel free to reach out and stay in contact with all of us. This is, and as I said, this is just the opening or the beginning to a lot of these inquiries. So thank you. And I'll hand it back to you, Priscilla.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I just want to give the panelists an opportunity, a few more, to just any closing thoughts, any final thoughts. I will go with Jeff.
I just want to thank you guys for inviting me. I saw that there was a question about private land. I know here in Colorado and in a lot of Western states, especially the more rural Western states, there are options. And this just because of my work with hospice. You have to have more than 5 acres, and you just have to register the place of burial with the county records. I guess, so if somebody else is gonna put in a swimming pool, they don't dig up grandma or something, you know, out of that respect for those, where those people are. But I do know that in some of these, like Colorado, Wyoming, a lot of those kind of ranching states, they have those kind of laws for private land that will allow you to do that. But I don't know about all 50. And then I appreciate these are challenging conversations. And I really do really want to thank you guys for allowing some of these topics that I know it's, you know, there's more technical things about green burial, but often some of these deeper things that are connected, because this is a cultural practice. And although maybe be new, there is a continuation of peoples on this land that have been doing this for thousands of years. But I appreciate giving space for those conversations and stories to be brought up. So.
Thank you, Jeff. Any final closing thoughts from Anna or Dr. Cami or Mary Ann?
Just thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Feel free to reach out, Cami at radicaldeathstudies.com or any of my social media.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists, the Peaceful Presence Project for partnering with us, for hosting March Green Drinks, to the attendees. You will be getting a recording of this and in the next day or so, and we'll make sure that we post it up on our YouTube page. And you can, we'll be following up with all the resources, everything that was mentioned. I took all the notes. So we'll definitely be following up with all the attendees and everyone who registered. Thank you again. Stay healthy, stay brave, speak up, speak out, and in solidarity, we are out. Thank you.